other bits and pieces as well. So, we're talking about how cover cropping can build fertility. It can also stop fertility leaving your field, which I think is an equally important factor. I talk a lot about building resiliency into your systems and your soils, and how that will help increase yields, particularly in times where the climate decides to stress the crops in different ways. How does this work? There we go. So I feel certainly from the testing that we've done, and if I give you some examples, we've tested the bits of soil under the hedge on the edge of a field, and that's measured sort of 8.5% carbon, and then the bit of the field that's been farmed is 2.7. That's a fairly damning indictment of how we've looked after the carbon in the soil, and that has lots of effects on the soil structure and its ability to do the things we need it to do. And once we get down to that sort of below 3%, 2.5% level, the soil becomes very unstable. And there's lots of evidence of that, things like compaction getting worse, waterlogging, weeds, yield declines, all that sort of thing. But, if you're on the same bus as me, you believe that healthy soils enhance yield and produce better crops, not just yield wise, but also the quality of what you're producing is better. Try that. So we've been using a lot of technology, but have we been using the technology to solve the wrong problems? We've been applying more horsepower and better bits of metal to solve problems that I think are better solved with biology. So these are sort of the soil functions that it provides to help plant production be successful. And some of them are obvious, with like supply of nutrients and water infiltrate or regulation of water. But it's equally important that a soil is capable of draining too much water, and it allows gas exchange and creation of charged surfaces, which is where the nutrition lies. But then some of these problems that we've had with soil degradation have created these threats. So some of these things, or I doubt you've got all of these problems, but you might have a number of these problems in soils on your farms. And they're all threats that affect how the soil functions to create healthy plant production. And then when you see how these interact with each other, it's quite a complicated picture, but there are so many things that not looking after our soil is making life hard for us elsewhere. I think it's something that, they always talk about the three-legged stool of physical, chemical and biological properties of soil. Sorry, my phone's ringing. Are you all there? Sorry, my phone went off and I wasn't expecting it to. They all sort of feed into this problem of creating problems for production. And I'm not trying to do soil improvement for the sake of it. I'm trying to make the soil that we are farming as efficient and effective at growing crops as we possibly can. So the consequences obviously being shown in things like soil erosion and wind blow, but the most important one I think is being shown in the yield of farm crops on generally, certainly in East Anglia, where I'm probably most familiar with this. And this only goes up to sort of 2015, but I think that you could extrapolate it further on, and it might even drop down a little bit. But you've seen some really big shifts in where yields have improved, and certainly from 1970 till probably about 2000, the yield went up very, very significantly with changes to fertilizer and crop technology, plant breeding, all those sorts of things. But pretty much since the year 2000, the yield hasn't increased at all. Some would say it's declined, and that's despite all of the improvements from plant breeders who always say every year in the recommended list the yield's gone up. Technological improvements with equipment and machinery, advancing agronomy, bigger, questionably better machinery, which tends to be heavier, more horsepower, able to deal with difficult conditions that perhaps it caused those in the first place. And there's figures, and again, this is probably back from 2015, that the average soil organic matter has gone from 3.4 to 2.8. And as I mentioned earlier, is that very, very serious worry that it's prone to structural deterioration at those levels. So, you know, I think most of us in this room would probably accept that the climate is changing. And, you know, we're certainly seeing when the weather, whatever weather we get, we seem to get more of it. It's either wetter, drier, hotter, colder, windier, whatever it is. But water is a big thing for farmers, either not enough of it or too much. And climate change does seem to be affecting how and when and how much water we receive, and it's generally unhelpful. So by looking after the soil, you can improve its ability to deal with a lot of water arriving all at once, or no water arriving for a period of time. So we've seen farms whose infiltration rates have gone from half an inch an hour to several inches in an hour. And then, you know, other farms where when the drought situation hits, their farm shows signs of drought 2 weeks later than the neighbours who are cultivating. And I keep trying to work out what 2 weeks of no drought stress apparent is worth, particularly at something like grain fill time. And, you know, we were talking about it, and we were talking about sort of a tonne a hectare. So it's a lot of money, you know, for those sorts of things. And this is all related to biology, soil structure, soil carbon, and all those sorts of things. So my particular sort of specialism is in using cover crops, and I genuinely don't believe that they're a cure-all. You know, some people talk about them like they're the holy grail, and they can do an awful lot of good things. But I'd suggest when you are using cover crops, you know what you want them to try and do before you start. That's the only way you're going to know whether they've done it. If you use them as a sort of you know, cure-all, you'll probably be disappointed because they won't do some of the things that you imagined. I think you want to include them in your planning as far as agronomy goes, because some of them can cause rotational problems if they're used incorrectly. A good example of that is if you're growing oilseed rape. Personally, I would leave mustard out of any of your mixes completely, because mustard can make clubroot a bit of a problem for up to 6 or 7 years after the mustard's been there. So I just leave mustard out if people are still growing rape. Radishes are less of a problem, but mustard is particularly bad. There's often been worries about legumes on farms where they grow peas and beans, but that seems to be less of a problem from some of the work that PGRO are doing. But again, I would trial this on your own farm. There's nothing like seeing it for yourself on your own farm, because I've lost count of the number of times I've done, you know, walks on farms in different places, and people have gone away saying, "Oh, that won't work here. That won't work on my farm," when actually, you know, it probably will. But certainly, you know, try it in a small way, but a meaningful way on your farm, and take some simple measurements, just simple things like counting the number of worms, but make sure you make a count before you start any changes, so you know where you've gone from. That's a big problem with lots of things we've been involved with, like stewardship and so on. The value of a baseline was never recognised by government. So how do you know you've improved if you don't know where you started from? But, you know, simple things like counting worms, I know it sounds simple, but it is genuinely effective, of a decent direction of travel. You know, it's not sort of demonstrating one particular improvement, but, you know, generally it means things are moving in the right direction. So the key thing for cover crops is getting them in the ground as early as possible. Your day length, your soil temperature, everything else is much better. You know, even 2 weeks or, you know, a week earlier in August makes a big difference. Obviously, the availability of moisture is very important too, but earliest of planting is key to getting that biomass, and all the science says that biomass is crucial for delivering more benefits. You know, once you get those leaves out and the crop starts photosynthesizing, it's driving lots of exudates going in the soil, and it's driving carbon being fed into the system. So the more of that you can get done as early as possible, the better. And clearly, a crop like that could be grazed, you know, by different stock that you might have available on the farm. This crop is actually only 8 weeks old, but you can see how tall and how dense it is. But that shows the capacity, if you get them in early enough, That's the kind of thing. That's what I would call a cover crop. That's a seven species mix. There's radish, vetch, phacelia, linseed, a couple of types of radish. I forget, there's probably some sunflowers in there as well. But that's only 8 weeks growth. So you can get them in good conditions. That's the kind of thing you can expect. The SFI is offering £129 a hectare, I think, for winter covers this time, which is similar to the payment for the code SW6 in countryside stewardship. I like the flexibility in the SFI, in as much as you put an area in year one, and in year two, if your fields are slightly different sizes, you only have to put a minimum of 50% of that area back in again, but you obviously can increase it and go up. There's a lot of things about SFI I like. I like some of the flexibility and the openness in it, as long as it's used in the right way. Unfortunately, some people are looking to use that flexibility to, basically do a very, very mediocre job to just collect the money. And I think that's disappointing, but that's where we are. But cover crops in SFI, that should certainly leave you some value compared to what it costs to do over what they're paying you. And if you can fit it into your system, then fantastic. This is a crop of, it's actually radish and beans and some phacelia. That what you can't see in that picture is there are about 30 farmers standing behind me when we drilled it with a sky drill, and I was genuinely thinking we were nuts. I really worried about how it was going to look afterwards. Calibrating the drill was fine, but actually working out what depth setting to use on the drill to get it through that bulk was a bit of a worry, but we did some tests and did it okay. And actually, this is the first time I've done it. I've done it lots of times since, because a few weeks later, that's the same field. It was really successful. The crop was very clean. The crop came up very evenly. We did use glyphosate to get rid of the previous crop. It was sprayed the day before we drilled. But anyone would be very happy with the condition of that crop. It wasn't full of slugs, which was another problem that people identified might be an issue. Really, really successful, good gross margin, good yield, relatively low cost crop to grow as well. So, they can be used in that sort of drilling green situation. Companion crops is another thing that's being able to be done in SFI. This is a crop of rape with berseem clover. We would normally use buckwheat, berseem clover and fenugreek as our favoured companion mix. It seems to work very well. But other companion crops might be, small leaf white clover in wheat, or something like spring beans is a good crop to get it established in. We're trialling linseed in wheat, which we think should work well, because what you've got to bear in mind is the additional payment you get from using a companion crop will not cover anything other than an absolutely tiny decrease in yield. So anything you do to grow the crop needs to be something that permits you to grow as good a crop of wheat or rape in this case as you could possibly do. So these sorts of companions in rape, it's very straightforward. In wheat, it's slightly more difficult, but we are finding combinations of pre-emergence herbicides that do allow things like linseed to be used and deliver the benefit. The other thing about linseed that I like for planting with wheat is linseed tends to root straight down. So it's rooting almost through the wheat and below it, whereas wheat tends to grow out at the beginning in the surface layers, as well as having some deeper roots. Clover tends to root in the same place as the wheat, so it could potentially be competing for resources like water. But the linseed seems to work really well in that respect. And really the sort of take home on all of this is, the soil is your main resource for delivering a profit on the farm, and you have to look after it. It's going to give you the best return of anything you do on the farm. But before you start worrying about things like cover crops, if your field needs drainage and you haven't sorted out the drainage on a farm, that has to be the first thing that you deal with. It's like big blocks and little blocks. Drainage is a big block. It's vital. And I've been trying with government to get them to fund or support or have a low interest loan or something for farmers to deal with drainage, because it's something that hasn't been done for 40 or 50 years. And you can see the amount of drainage that's been done 40, 50 years ago. It dropped off a cliff when the funding stopped. And the drains that were being put in there had a working life of about 40 to 50 years. So they're all getting to the end of that life. And, more and more people are realizing that they've got a lot of catching up to do. But, a drained soil where it needs it is critical for soil health before anything else, because you have to be able to get that excess water away. The rate of decline of your bottom line will accelerate as your soil organic matter is lost. That's fairly evident with a lot of people. And climate change is creating those weather challenges because the weather is more severe. But we are seeing ourselves at scale on farms how cover crops are improving soils relatively quickly. Not in 1 year, but certainly in 3 to 4 years, we're seeing significant, meaningful changes for the better. And as I said earlier, try it on your own farm to see for yourself. It's not as new as it was 3 or 4 years ago. You'll probably find someone in your local area who's done quite a lot of it that you could use as a resource. There's an excellent group called Base UK, and for full disclosure, I'm on the committee of Base UK, but it's a farmer organisation around no-till farming and regenerative agriculture, and it's really good. They have for your students, they have an excellent student membership that's I think it's only 20 quid a year, but they do a lot of really good webinars and things. So there'd be a group that I'd recommend that you got involved with. But again, lots of agronomists now are starting to get on board with it, and other farmers that you might know in your area. So that's kind of the end of that presentation, as it were. So if you've got any questions on that, I'll be more than happy to deal with them.
Ian, thank you. That was wonderful. It's an ever-changing field that we're having to run to keep up with, and there's so many people think they have a perfect answer and so many permutations. It can be an absolute minefield. One question from me, as a livestock farmer alongside an arable rotation, it should be symbiotic, but usually isn't, due to so many factors. A big problem we're having currently is the lack of oilseed rape going in Lincolnshire, which has meant cabbage stem flea beetle has attacked all sorts of other things that it historically hasn't bothered too much with. We look to put stubble turnips in or other root crops to provide a feed source for our ewes after November till February. We take them off all the grassland. It's been decimated this year by cabbage stem flea beetle, all our root crops, and the larvae is actually now killed all the bulbs. It's stopped taking the roots off the bulbs, so the bulbs are not forming. It's absolute disaster. I'm just looking for other alternative crops that would mitigate some of these constant problems and changes that we have. I know that's different on every farm, but it's something we're seriously going to have to look at, getting a winter crop out and a spring crop back in, but using that period for a food source for livestock in a new way.
Where exactly are you?
Lincolnshire. So we're in Lincoln. We're near Lincoln University.
Okay, fine. So you should reasonably be able to get stuff in middle of August after a winter cereal, generally. Yeah. Okay. Well, certainly, I mean, we have a type of radish called smart radish, which was specifically designed for soil and grazing. It's a very, very fast growing radish with a 30% bigger leaf area at the top and a decent sized bulb as well. Now, we do sow that on its own. Very often we put it in after maize harvest down south as a sort of fast growing crop, because it grows a lot quicker than stubble turnips would grow in the same amount of time. But I would suggest to you that you grow those sorts of things in a mix with something like forage rye, maybe some winter vetch, as well as the turnips or the radish, or even put some turnips in as well if you wanted to. But certainly where we've grown crops in combination, the effect of the flea beetle has tended to be less bad. I'm not suggesting again any of these things are magic bullets, because they're not, but they do help. You know, the flea beetle. I mean, I'm fully supportive of the ban on neonicotinoids. I know that won't go down well with some people, but I am. You know, I've seen science from this country and from the States, which is pretty damning, frankly. And I just don't want the stuff used. I don't feel the same way about glyphosate, I'll be honest. I think we can use glyphosate intelligently and unintelligently. There are things I'm less comfortable with it being used for. And, you know, again, the context of where you say that, you have to be really careful, because
absolutely,
if you're a farmer in Hampshire and you tend to get nice weather at harvest, and you think, oh well, I can promise that I'll never use glyphosate to artificially ripen a crop, you're probably right. But if you're farming in Northumberland or Dumfriesshire or something, absolutely, it's a completely different issue. And actually, you know, there's another argument, which is, well, if you can't harvest these things without dangerous products putting on them, should you be growing them? Now, that's not necessarily something I agree with, but it is an argument. But I would like to see glyphosate not used to pre-harvest desiccate, personally. But I'm really comfortable with it being used at a sensible rate to kill off green cover before growing the crop that somebody's going to eat, somebody or something is going to eat. I'm really comfortable with that. You know, it's just something I think it's like most of these things. Sometimes you have to make the least bad choice. Yeah. And it's probably less bad than lots of cultivation, which seems to be the other way of doing it. And I actually spoke to a guy called Dr. Alan Williams, who works with Gabe Brown in the States. And he told me that some of the worst soil health he's ever seen is on organic farms in America, because what they're doing is they're going into organic conversion to tick the organic box, and they're basically farming with no inputs for a period of time and then moving on somewhere else. Because, you know, what they're doing is they're not farming in a proper organic way. Because I'd be the first one to say there are lots of really good things we can learn about organic farming, like fertility building crops and all those sorts of things. There are lots of good things, but my concern is, if you have a system which is basically a list of things you're not allowed to do, that's not a very good starting point, because sometimes an undesirable thing to do is still the best thing to do in the circumstances.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? It does. Like, you know, sometimes, you know, if you've got a lion 300 yards away and your hand's stuck, it's better to cut your hand off, isn't it? You know,
absolutely. Lesser of two evils, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So there are always things, and you know, anytime you start interfering with nature and farming, there are compromises. But there are some compromises that I think are better than others. And unfortunately, we seem to be moving into a very binary world where it's either good or bad, black or white, and it's nearly always shades of grey, isn't it?
It is. I don't know if it's happening in other areas, but we've seen a huge resurgence in the plough in the ground this year. There's more people ploughing land around here than I've ever seen. And a lot of cover crops gone in, and a lot of drilling direct into cover crops, huge amounts of good practice, but the plough has definitely seen a resurgence.
This is a devil's advocate question. Do you think that's really the case, or are you just noticing it more because, yeah, is it still nowhere near what it used to be? It's just more than there's been for a bit.
I think it's probably crop choice. There's a lot of maize now grown for AD, and as the maize comes off to get back to wheat, it's nearly all ploughed to get rid of that stubble and to stop slugs and sugar beet as well. There's a lot of ground ploughed for sugar beet. So as a percentage, it's definitely increased, but it's probably rotation based.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And funnily enough, I was in a web sort of chat this morning in the States, and they were talking about min-tilling wheat after maize, and nearly all the people who were on there were saying don't do it because it's there's a lot more disease after maize.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I'm not sure that it necessarily has to be true, but I think that's people's experience when they first
perception.
start. Well, no, it's not even a perception, it's actually true when people start. But it's like,
Right, I've got you.
when you start getting your soil health in better order and better shape and more balanced, because a lot of soils are out of balance. That's a word we use a lot. Where soils are more balanced, I think some of these problems don't occur anything like they do in soils that are fundamentally buggered in one way or another. And it's almost, you kind of need to go a bit cold turkey to get through some of the issues and come out the other side. But the temptation is always to go back to the thing you know. And again, I would never say never plough, but I would definitely think ploughing is used more than it probably needs to be. But ultimately, the guys have to do what's best for their business and their bottom line.
Absolutely.
I get it. I'm not too evangelical about it. I'm pretty practical about it. And but if we could all start doing some of this and do some things better than we're doing them, and I don't necessarily mean economically better, but I think ultimately they will be economically better, because it'll cost you less to produce the same thing, but that doesn't happen immediately.
It's quite a lot of maize being monocropped again, which is a practice that was more common 15, 20 years ago, but there's a lot of people doing it again.
Yeah.
For the same reasons, of disease and risk and but that does mean there's quite a lot of soil bare over winter, which could be doing something different.
And soil on the roads and all sorts of other things that sometimes get associated with it. I think it was Germany that they funded a lot of biodigesters which were being fed with maize, and then they realised what harm it was doing, and they paid people out and stopped it. They realised it was a policy mistake. We haven't realised that yet. I mean, there are good things about maize. It's a good solution to blackgrass, or it's a big help with blackgrass and ryegrass in a rotation. It's a good crop from return point of view. The digestate can be helpful. There are lots of things that are positive about it, but I don't see it helping soil structure very often. And as you tend to be on the land at time of year, you often don't want to be on there. So yeah,
both ends of the year.
Yeah, again, it's shades of grey, isn't it?
It is.
But it's also with crops like potatoes. There are bits of land that are probably ideally suited to potatoes that don't grow them anymore because of problems with nematodes and things like that. So potatoes are now being grown on bits of land that really aren't that suitable for them.
No, that's right.
And it's a really difficult thing for the individual farmer to walk away from a deal that looks good on paper and looks good in a year or 2 years, whatever. But actually, it's the unintended consequences of that down the line. And we've done some work, soil health work in root crops, and what we're finding is what used to happen was potatoes might be late lifted on a piece of ground, and the ground would look like the Somme afterwards, and then they'd maul in a crop of wheat in the winter to try and get something in, which would be a crap crop of wheat, and would never make any money. And as I said earlier, bad crops follow bad crops. So the next crop wasn't very good either.
No.
What we did on a crop in Norfolk was we put in a summer cover crop to be like a rescue, soil rescue mix, if you like. And the farmer will tell you that was the best yielding piece of wheat the following year, because we put the soil back in good heart again. Now, that might be something that ought to become normal, in that after a late sown root crop, you just have to put that in, because the yield of the next 3 crops makes up for what you would have lost by that not very good crop, followed by another not very good crop, possibly followed by another not very good crop.
Yeah.
So you have to look at it in rotation. The problem is that the company we were working with at the time, 70% of the potatoes that were grown for them were grown by people on land they didn't own. So they only actually had control of that land for the year that the potatoes were in there.
Yeah.
And that structural issue is a big issue for solving these other problems that surround it.
Yeah,
So
long-term planning, isn't it? A short-term game, but it's that long-term approach, isn't it?
yeah.
I'm reluctant to interrupt.
Sorry, we could talk all afternoon.
I know, and it's a
brilliant.
really interesting conversation. I'm just aware that we're 2 minutes over time already, and some people might need to leave. If anybody does need to leave, that's yeah, absolutely fine, of course. But I don't know, Ian, if you've got any, if you're able to stay on, if there are more questions, if anybody did have more questions.
I've got, 5 or 10 minutes is fine. Yeah, no problem.
I have another meeting, but tremendous to meet you. Lizzie can stay on, but I've got the dreaded Teams on another computer. But thank you ever so much, everybody.
Thanks for joining us, Matt. Did anybody have any other questions for Ian?
Everyone's vanishing, so obviously had enough soil talk.
That was really, really interesting, Ian. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. I'll send the recording round to people who weren't able to make it, as I'm sure they'll be interested to see that too. And thank you, Matt and Lizzie, as well, for joining us.
No worries. If anyone's got any sort of questions as a result of watching the recording, by all means, pass on my contact details, and if I can help, very happy to.
Brilliant. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll put that in the email to everybody. Brilliant.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Right. Nice to meet you all.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.